So next we're going to mark and do our darts. If you are an experienced seamstress or sewist, and you have a particular way you prefer to do your darts, or you already know a way, then please go ahead and do that. There is a dart on either side of the back, and if you're doing the lining, they'll be exactly the same on the lining as well. And you do the darts whether you're doing the knit or the woven version, any option at all in the pattern, all of them have the same darts. So go ahead and do that now if you're happy to do that. If not, I'm going to show you how I do my darts, how I prefer to do it. Now at the moment I've got my fabric folded so that it's right sides out. I'm going to switch that around so that it is wrong side out, so right sides together, because I want my pins to be on the wrong side of the fabric. And then I'm going to get some pins here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin my dart marking. And this is one of the reasons why it's great to print with layers, is there would only be one dart here rather than all of these to try and figure out. Now I'm doing the size 3 to 4, so I know it's this long dashed blue line. Each of the lines has a different style and a different colour. And what I want to do is I'm going to line up my my pattern piece, and I'm going to place a pin at the very bottom edge of the dart. And as you can see, I'm on my ironing board here with my favourite new ironing board cover, and so that I can just shove the pin straight into the fabric and not worry about making a mark on my table. And then I'm going to put another pin at the top on one side, and then another pin at the top on the other side. So there are 3 pins, each of them is going squarely into the dart, and then I will push my pins in as far as they'll go and lift my pattern piece up. And I'm going to get a 4th pin, and I'm going to find the base of one of the pins I've put through and put a pin in at exactly the same point, and then I can remove that pin. So now basically what I've got is the pin in exactly the same place as it was, but it is on the fabric versus through the paper. Do the same on that side, and I'm really pushing my pins in as far as they'll go, and then the same on the bottom. So now I can take my pattern piece away, and my fabric has 1, 2, 3 pins in it. I'm going to lift my fabric up and push the pins all the way in. Now if you're using Georgette or chiffon or something like that, at this point the pins tend to just fall out. So what I would do is then take the pins and make them go through the fabric. Oh dear. Let's put that back in. Make them go through the fabric, and then do the same marking on the other side. But as this is a cotton, it's going to stay on there, and it probably will for most knits as well. Then I'm going to turn the fabric over without losing my pins. It's kind of hard to see on camera because the pins haven't got coloured stems, but I'm now going to stick a pin in at the base of where the pin's coming out. So now I've got pins sticking through, and I don't know if you can see that, both sides of my fabric here, and then I can gently pull them apart, and again that's another place where the pins can just come flying out. And I'm gonna put the pins so that they then are not just pointing straight through. I'm gonna pin them through the fabric. It doesn't really matter where you pin them, but just so that now I've got both of my darts marked, 3 here. And now what I suggest you do is that you go away to a flat hard surface and then take some tailor's chalk, not blue because my fabric is blue, but maybe a pink tailor's chalk or an erasable pen, and you're going to draw this exact same shape from that marking up there down to the bottom and then back up to the top, and extend past it so that you get that that whole triangle. And again on the other side as well, straight down, straight up through the triangle, so that you get that marking on your fabric. And then we're going to come back and let's pretend I've got my markings on here, and I want to take this first pin and I'm going to take it out, but keep the tip of it in the fabric, and then go straight through where the other pin on the other side is. And I can take the other pin out, and then I can pull it up, and then pull this one around, and I just want to mark where the end of that is. So now when I've got my fabric folded right sides together, I should have a line coming down here which I can stitch on my machine so I know exactly where I'm going, and I've got it pinned together at the top and at the bottom, so it'll be nice and square. And then I'll do exactly the same with the other one, do that, and then I'm ready to sew. So what I'm going to do now is stitch this dart, and I'm going to line my machine up and put my needle down near the top of the fabric, right where that pin is, and it'll be on this line that I've drawn down here with tailor's chalk. Then once my needle is in, I can pull out my pin and place my presser foot down. Now very often when I start right near the edge of the fabric, I find the feed dog, which is the bit under the machine that does this all of the time, and moves the fabric along, pulls my fabric down into my machine and then makes a big old mess. So what I do is I don't know if you can see that, you can hold my threads really taut out the back of the machine, and I'm going to just stitch slowly, whoops, not that fast, those first few stitches, and then I can reverse and do my back stitch, and then I'm going to stitch down this line, following this line all the way to the bottom. And when I get near the pin at the bottom, if you're nervous, don't go quite as close as I just went. I've done this a lot, so I'm quite comfortable with it. Then I'm going to use the, I think it's called the hand wheel, the big round thing on the side of the machine. I'm never quite sure of the name, to get as close as I can to that pin. I'm not going to do that with my foot pedal because I do not want to run over the pin and have an accident of any sort. And I want to also get this really accurate. I want to come in on that nice gentle line along there that we drew, not coming in and going all of a sudden, because that will not sit nicely over the bottom or lower back. And then I'm going to pull this out, and what I want to do is I want to leave a decent amount of threads. You can trim your threads at the top, but this one at the bottom here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie that. Oh, I haven't quite left enough. Oh, that's really hard. I'm going to tie that in a knot. There we go, one. And then again, I'm going to tie that a couple of times to secure it. The reason I'm not doing a back stitch, it's just not quite long enough, is it? The reason I'm not doing a back stitch there is because it leaves a little lump in the fabric. Now I can trim those off so that they're about 1/2 inch long. They don't need to be quite as long as I've left it there. Leave them longer, like 2 or 3 inches, is much easier to tie. Well, that's probably 3 or 4 inches maybe. And then trim them down to 1/2 inch, and then that way when you open up your back of your fabric, the dart is coming down here, and by the time I've pressed that will be practically unnoticeable at the bottom, versus sometimes you see at the bottom of darts there's a little kind of funny blob of fabric just there. That is where you've come in too sharply to the dart, or you've done a back stitch at the bottom. So that's why I tie them in a nice little knot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my darts outwards towards the side seam once I've trimmed that all up. Some people prefer to push them inwards. I don't. I like them going outwards because I like the shape it gives over the lower back. So then that is your darts done. You want to do a dart on either side of the back piece, and then if you're doing a lining, repeat on the lining, and that's the same for knits and wovens. So the next thing we're going to do is our back pieces. This is not the order that the pattern does it in, but I'm trying to show you all of the different knit versus woven, open back, partially open back, lined, all of those things through the sew along, so that no matter what one you want to do, you can do it. So we're not going to follow the order of the pattern, but the order of the pattern does go together a bit smoother than this. So if you want to, go ahead and follow the order of the pattern for whichever option you're doing. Otherwise, follow along with this and it will be fine. I've worked it out. So we're going to do the back join here, and then adding the top back to the back of the skirt next. Now what I would recommend before you take your fabric off your pattern piece is that you grab a couple of pins and see where it says shoulder seam up the top. For each layer of your back, pop a pin along the shoulder seam so that you know that that is the shoulder seam. We had a couple of ladies during our testing do it the wrong way up, because when you take the pattern piece off, that corner looks like that corner, that side looks like that side, and you kind of get it up way round and you're like, oh my goodness, which way round is it? Wow. So if you put a pin there on both sides of the fabric, you know that's the shoulder and you're not going to mess that up. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to do the knit version, or the knit fabric of the open, with the open back, and then we'll do the woven fabric with the open back, and then I'll show you the partially closed. So if you want to fast forward me, if you're doing the partially closed back, go right on ahead. Otherwise we're going to carry on with the open back, and please bear with me, there are quite a lot of versions to do to show you all of this for the back. Once we move on to the front, it's the same for all of the different options, so there'll be far less fast forward me if you want to, but bear with me for this bit. So here is one I prepared earlier. Ta-da! It's as if by magic I have suddenly just stitched it. You have two options for the open back knit. Three options. You can either do an overcast stitch down the center back on your sewing machine, and I don't know if that's going to focus as I show you that. It kind of comes out a little bit bubbly along the edges, but if you've got a knit that frays, most knits don't, but the occasional one does, you want to finish it, or you could leave it raw as the second option, or the third option is if you've got a serger, you could serge that edge. So I've done one of each here so that you can see what that looks like. And I pressed all of this fabric so that it would look so nice for you, and then it just curls, and all of my different fabrics are doing it. I've got a brand new iron. I don't know if it's my iron, perhaps. It's certainly not the fabric because they're all doing it, but I apologise for my curly pattern pieces. So we're gonna, you do not have to do that. You can leave that centre back edge raw, because this is my shoulder up the top here, and that's my centre back. Then the next thing we're going to do is our button loop. Now you need to decide what side of the back you want it to be on. There are all kinds of traditions as to why things often close one way over the other. I don't mind. I just usually pick a side because I am generally not concerned which one I am doing. So what you need to do now is get a little ruler and measure in, or when you're serging and overcasting, you're not taking anything off this edge. You're going to leave this edge the same width, and then I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch in with a pin, and then I'm going to measure 1/2 inch down with a pin, because what I want to happen is that my button loop, when this is folded under the seam allowance there like that, I want my button loop to stick out nicely like that. And so what I'm going to do now, so I'm going to have that folded under, and then the reason I've measured down, the reason I've measured 1/2 inch down as well, oh my curly fabric, stop it, is because I know that's my seam allowance going there, and I don't want my loop above there, I want it down below. And I'm going to cut a little piece of ribbon, and what I want to do is fold that back on itself so that it makes a nice little loop like that, and I'm going to place a pin through my loop here so that it is like that. So if you can see that against the white like that, and then what I want is for when it is being worn, the loop to be from underneath sticking out like that, where just below where those two pins merge. And then grab your button, and what you want to do is make sure that your button goes through that gap. So that's a little bit, if you can see that, that's a little bit big for my button. I want to make my loop a bit smaller, so I'm going to adjust that. I'm going to move my loop in and then hold that there, and I'll try again, check my button goes through. That's perfect. I don't want that to be any looser or any tighter, or my button won't go through. And then I will fold my fabric back out, and I'm going to pin that now. That's all a bit messy, I'm trying to show the camera while doing it neatly, and I can take these two pins out here. So I now know that that is in exactly the right place. It's below the 1/2 inch seam allowance, coming down but not too far low, and when this is folded under, it's going to have exactly the right amount of loop left to have my button go through it. So now go away and stitch that down. So what I should have said is that if you're doing the thread button loop, don't do it right now. This is only if you're doing the ribbon or using elastic or something like that to have a button loop there. So I've just stitched that right where that serger is, or where the overcast is, so about 1/4 of an inch in, not the whole 1/2 inch in, because that'll get stitched down in a moment. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to, there's a little bit of leftover ribbon, so I cut the excess off. And then I'm going to press this so that I've got my 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you want to measure it, measure it. But that's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to press that, and then I'm going to top stitch down the centre back. And then on my other back piece, I will do exactly the same thing, except I do not need the button loop on this side. I'm going to press it back 1/2 inch, and then from the right side of the fabric, I'm going to top stitch all the way from the top to the bottom, and that is our open back part of the back for the knit version complete. So something I should have mentioned before is that this sew along might be a little different to some of the other ones you've done, and that I'm not going to show you every single seam on the sewing machine where it's just a straight stitch. I'll tell you what I need to, and then just show you the bits where it's a bit tricky on the machine. If you have any questions about the bits where we're actually doing the sewing bit, please do ask them. I just don't want to make this 2 hours long every day for you to watch, so I'm trying to show you it at a speed, but also get everything else in there. So please do ask questions in the comments if you need to. So I've stitched down the backs. Now I have not pressed this, which is why it's a little bit wavy, because I really don't want it to curl, because then it's hard for you to see. So you should press this and use a little bit of steam if you need to make sure that that then sits nice and flat. And this is a knit fabric one that I'm doing, so I've used a lightning bolt stitch down here. You could also use a twin needle or a zigzag. And that's just on your regular sewing machine. Now I've got my my back skirt here, and I've got my darts that I've stitched in, and what I'm going to do is take my two back pieces that I've placed above it, and I'm going to fold them down so that they are right sides together, joining at this seam here, which is kind of at the waist just above it. And these should match exactly. I grade using a computer program, so it should match to the pixel that these back pieces match your back of your skirt. If they do not, it is likely because either you've used the shoulder seam rather than the waist seam, which is why we put the pins in at the beginning, or that the darts are not in, or you may have traced or cut the wrong size top for the wrong size bottom. So check that if it doesn't match, otherwise it should match. And then I'm going to either pin or clip this at the waist here, and then at the my curly fabric at the other end. I'm sure it's my iron. It's done it on all of them, on the cotton pieces as well. Who knows? I'm sure somebody out there's got the answer as to why it's doing that. It's a brand new iron. It's awesome. It's like a steam one, but yeah, maybe it's a steam. I don't know. Anyway, I like having my my darts pressed outwards, so I'm also going to put a pin into each dart to hold it there so that it doesn't move as I stitch. And then all of the seam allowances are 1/2 inch, so I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to stitch across here. And then because this is the knit version, you could leave it raw, or you could do an overcast or a serger stitch. If you're going to leave it raw, just trim it slightly to tidy it up, and then press it downwards, so then you've got your back piece totally complete and ready to move on to the front bit. So next we're going to move on to the woven open back. So I'm going to show you a slightly different technique too in the pattern. If you want to look up how to do the binding down the centre back for the woven one in the pattern, you can, but I like to show you a couple of new things so that you can pick some different techniques if you want to in a sew along. So this is my woven back piece, and it's beautifully spotty fabric, and I didn't think about the white versus the white, so hopefully you can still see that. I'm going to turn it so that it's on its wrong side facing up, and then with these handy little lines here I've pressed earlier, I'm going to fold it back 1/4 inch, and then 1/4 inch again, and then from the front of, and I'll press that, and from the front of the fabric I'm going to top stitch down that centre back open. So this is the open back version using the woven, and I'll show you a handy one that I prepared earlier. Ta-da! It's as if I'd just gone away and stitched it. So as you can see here, it's folded under twice. It's just a nice neat finish, and top stitch down. The alternative in the pattern is a binding down here, which will then match the binding that we'll do along the neckline for this. So go ahead and do that bit now. So I've now stitched down my centre backs of my woven top pieces, and then I've got my skirt here where I did the darts earlier, and then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the knit. Is I'm going to fold this down, flip those down so that the top back pieces are now on top of the skirt, and then I'm going to pin in the center so that these back edges should meet exactly. If they don't, then as I said before, either you might have it flipped up the wrong way with the shoulder seam down here, or there you might be missing your darts. So make sure that that matches exactly, and then I'll pin at the end, and then I'm going to stitch along here using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you can, if you want to, serge along this edge here to finish it, because this is unlined woven version. We want to finish this raw edge so it doesn't fray inside the dress. I'm going to use this bias binding rather than the one that matches the dress, which pains me because I love everything to match, but I also really want you to be able to see it on camera, and you're not going to be able to see it in that white. So I've got this one here, and what we're going to do is bind this edge along here, and I'll flip it over so you can see it a bit easier. So what I'm going to do is, this is a double fold bias tape. It's actually a bit larger than what we need, but with the print and the colour, it's one that you can see really easily on camera, and as you can see, it folds right out. So yours will be narrower than this, and what you will need to do is trim 1/4 inch. So trim your seam here, your seam allowance here in half, so that it matches the right size for your bias tape. Now some people line it right up next to the edge. I don't like to do that because I want to give myself some wiggle room, so I'm going to line mine up so that it goes slightly over the edge, and then I'll just trim off the excess later. And I'm going to unfold this this first side. I'm going to leave the other side folded, but the top edge I'm going to unfold, and then I'm going to pin this with it overlapping a bit along here, and I'm going to pin it directly on top of the seam we have just stitched. So I'm pinning, and we're going to stitch along the fold line that is on the bias tape. That should, if you've trimmed 1/4 inch off and you're using 1/4 inch double fold bias tape, then that will match. There we go. So that runs off either side, and I'm going to finish that up in a minute. And then I'm going to stitch along this line here, and so go away and do that, and then we'll come back. So I want to show you how I do this on the sewing machine. I'm going to line up my presser foot with this fold, which is directly on top of the seam that we did earlier to stitch the top to the skirt. So I've lined up, so my needle is going to be running down this edge here, and because it runs, I've put the bias tape so it runs off the edge. Just be careful that you don't accidentally also stitch the edge of the sleeve into this. So I'm just going to pull the sleeve out of the way with that hand, and then I'm going to stitch down this line, and I'm not so worried about back stitching at the end because I'm going to fold this bias tape over in a minute, and I'm just going to carry on stitching, making sure my back, because it's an open back, is folded out of the way, and I'm stitching down this line, down the fold, all the way to the end, and it's going to be right on top of my stitches from where the top met the skirt. And I'm going to keep this sleeve out of the way, and then just run right to the edge of it. Don't worry about how far you're going. There we go. And then this is that, we're going to fold that up in a moment. So what I'd like you to do now is to just trim about 1/8 of an inch off this, really not very much, just a little bit to get rid of the bulk, and then press that up, and I'll see you back in a moment. So this is how we finished it a moment ago. We just stitched down this seam, and then what I've done is I've just trimmed a tiny little bit off the edge here so that that's nice and neat and it removes a little bit of the bulk from that seam, and then I have pressed it so that the bias tape is upwards. Then I want you to flip it over and fold the bias tape all the way over to the other side. Then we are going to pin this, or you can clip it, whichever you prefer. And now our raw edges are all tucked up inside, and if you've done any of my patterns before, you know that's totally my thing. I love all of the raw edges being hidden. It's just so pretty. There we go. So then when we have stitched that and we open it up there, you've got your beautifully finished front and then your beautifully finished back. So what we need to do now is stitch down along here, and then we're going to trim those edge bits off. And when I say top stitch, this is in the pattern, top stitching is about an eighth of an inch, about an eighth of an inch from the edge. So you're just trying to go as close as you can to that edge. Or alternatively, if you like being really tricksy and beautiful, you can fold it over so that this goes slightly further down than this, and then do what's called stitching in the ditch, which is where you stitch directly in that little bit in between the bias tape and the fabric, and it will just catch that really neatly. I like to see what I'm doing, so I generally top stitch along on that side. So go ahead and do that now. So I've stitched all the way along there now, and then what I'm going to do is very carefully just trim off these extra edges of the bias tape, because we don't need those now. And then I'm going to press this, one down. Quite often with the waist curve, depending on your size, you might find it easy to press this up. But look, my bias tape doesn't match my dress, so I'm gonna press mine down. I'm gonna try, but that's kind of messy, isn't it? Okay, I am gonna do what I should do, and I'm gonna press it up and be proud of my crazy bias tape under my dress. And then that is the open back woven version complete. And next we're gonna move on to the lined version, which is either knit or woven for the open back, and then we'll go to the partially back, closed back. So this is the lined version. Now, it doesn't matter if you're using knit or woven fabric, it's exactly the same for both. So what I've got, I'm not going to do any finishing of this centre back seam like we've done previously, unless your fabric is super frays. So if it frays heaps, what you might want to do is actually just run a serging or overcasting or zigzag stitch literally around all of your pattern pieces, and then continue on as if you're not going to do any edge finishing. So every single one, your front, your back, your two backs, your front skirt, your back skirt, the whole thing. But other than that, if you've just got regular fabric that doesn't fray heaps, knit or woven, what you're going to do is exactly what we did before, is flip your back pieces down onto your skirt, and we're going to do them one at a time, but I just want to show you how they line up first. Then I'm going to pin the one edge of one piece of the back top to the skirt, and that is flipped down like that. Then I'm going to get my little ruler here, and I'm going to measure half an inch in. It's a curved pin, that's not very helpful, is it? Half an inch in from the edge, and I just want to measure in from the edge of the top. I'm not going to pin the skirt. In fact, you could have done this before we started pinning, really, couldn't we? And then I'm going to do exactly the same on the other piece. I'm going to measure in half an inch, and you will see why I'm doing that in just a moment. So both these are measured in like that, and then I'm going to pin where that, I'm going to keep this really flat. I'm not stretching either piece, and if you've cut accurately, this pin will now be sat in the exact centre back of the skirt. And then I also want to pin my darts so that they stay pressed outwards. And then when I do, I'm not going to do the other one right now because I want to go stitch this bit first, but when I attach the other side, that's going to line up at the edge, and then that center pin should meet, if we've done it right, ta-da, exactly in the middle, and both of them will have their 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we are not going to finish this or press this open yet, because that will get stitched to the lining, this bit here. All we are doing is stitching using a 1/2 inch seam allowance across there, and we're leaving these little flaps here in the middle free. So what I want you to do now is go away, stitch along here and stop at that pin. Do not stitch this little flap down. So I've got my back piece now on my machine, and I'm going to stitch across this waist seam, but I'm going to stop at that bottom pin. I've got mine set on a lightning bolt stitch, because this is a zigzag. This is a knit fabric, but you're doing exactly the same thing with woven. You would just use a straight stitch instead, making sure your darts stay pressed out towards the side seam. And then I'm coming along here, I'm staying with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then as I get close to this pin, I'm just pulling the pin out so that it is no longer underneath the needle, so that I can't accidentally hit it, because safety is key. So I'm pulling it out, but I want to keep it still with its point just slightly into the fabric, so that I can see where I want to stop, because this is really important to stitch accurately. And then when I'm 1 stitch away, I press my little magic button that I've got here, and my machine is going to do a stationary back stitch. If your machine does not have a stationary back stitch, I call it the blob stitch, because it just does it in one little blob. I don't know what the technical term is, I'm sorry. Then you would need to very carefully, once you reach that pin, back stitch a couple and then come forward again a couple, because you want that to not undo itself. That needs to be secure, because there's going to be a little bit of pressure on that particular bit. So let's now attach the other side. So I've got my one side of my back attached with the seam allowance still open in the center, and then I'm going to place my other one, making sure that I get it the right way up, because obviously I flipped it down and then I've moved it away. So you should have a little pin in the top of your shoulder seam here to remind you that's the shoulder. That will be the bit that flips back up again. So you are looking for this to match exactly. If it does not, you might have your pattern piece around the wrong way. So then I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did before. I'm going to pin it at the side seam, and then I'm going to pin this pin. I'm going to make sure this is really, really open, this little flap of fabric, and then I'm going to pin that pin right in the center as well. So I do not want to catch that fabric, but I want to be butted right up against it. And then where my dart is, I'm also going to put another pin. Obviously put as many pins in as you like. I generally don't tend to even sew with pins. I generally tend to sew with clips, but I'm trying to show you this really accurately. So a pin in your dart, and then you can see here my stitch line stops exactly where my pin is there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to fold that back so it's not in the way, and I'm going to use the exact same 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch along here, and I want, when I look at the back of the fabric, this to be totally continuous. So there are 2 ways you could do it. You could either stitch from the front of the fabric and just make sure that you're kind of continuing that exact same 1/2 inch down seam allowance, or you could flip it over and stitch from the back, so that you make sure you get that continuous. But you have to be really, really careful to leave these not attached or stitched down in any way if you're going to do it from the back. I'm going to do it from the front. So now I'm going to continue this seam along, and I want to make sure that I'm staying along this 1/2 inch long line, but that I've got both of these little seam allowances flipped backwards. Then I'm going to use the hand wheel to put my needle down into the fabric, and I'm just going to check underneath that I haven't got anything caught, and that I'm bang on my 1/2 inch seam allowance line, so that I'm continuing on exactly where I started. And then I can take my pin out and I can stitch down here. Now my machine automatically does a little a couple of stitches on itself at the beginning of that seam, so I know that I've got that that back stitched there. But if you don't, you would need to carefully do a back stitch there, because that will have some pressure on it, and you want to make sure that's back stitched on. And then all the way to the edge, trying not to wobble like me, and keep it straight. and then to the other edge. So now what we should have, once I've trimmed my threads, hurrah! I was a little bit nervous turning this over to see whether I actually did do it in a straight line. Ta-da! I did. So you can see there's like a millimetre in between the two stitches there, so they practically meet, and that goes all in a straight line all the way across the back. And then on the other side, we've got this so that these two little bits are free. And then if I fold the top up and I fold it all so that it's not all messy, they meet there in the middle, and we will finish this centre bit here when we attach the lining. For now though, you want to press this seam, and if you need to, trim along here to keep it all tidy, but do not press these back edges. We're going to leave them for now. So here we go, I've finished this and I've pressed it, and I'm pressing that seam down towards the skirt, and that should curve nicely like that, and then these two bits here should meet right in the middle, and that is the lined version of the open back done for the back. And then now we're going to move on to the partially closed back. Thank you so much for bearing with me for all of these versions. For the front, I promise it's just one for all of the options. So partially closed back coming up next. Before we move on, I better show you the lining for the lined open back, which is exactly the same. So this is hard to see because it's light. I totally didn't think of that, but I've done exactly the same thing. I've stitched the back pieces along one side and then along the other side, and from the back of the fabric you can see that little flap there, and then pressed it down. And from the front of the fabric, isn't this beautiful, this fabric? I can't wait. My daughter is gonna go crazy for this. She's like sequin pink, white, like galore. She loves this stuff. And then it meets right in the centre back there, and that is the lining for the open back option. So we're moving on to the partially closed back. The first bit of the knit version is exactly the same as the open back. You can leave your raw edges raw, you can overcast stitch them like I showed you before, or you can serge them. I've serged these ones, and then you're going to take your little loop, and if you want to see this slower, it's at the beginning where we talk about the open back. I've put it into a little loop, and then I'm going to choose which back piece I want to put it on, measure in 1/2 inch, measure down 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to put it so that the loop is facing into the fabric, and I'm going to then pin that there and fold it under like that. Check my button goes through there comfortably without too much leeway. If there's too much leeway, I'll move it in a little bit, and then make sure it's all pinned nicely. And I'm going to stitch it down at kind of between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. You don't want it to go beyond the 1/2 inch and show on the back of the fabric, but you also don't want it to be too close to the raw edge, or it's going to make more of a gap for the button to get through, and you want it to be kind of snug but not too tight. So stitch that down, and then we're going to carry on. Right, so I've got my button loop here stitched down, and then I'm going to take my other back piece, and just as we as I said before with the open back version, you want to make sure that you've put a little pin at the top where the shoulder seam is in both bits of your fabric, so that you don't get them the wrong way up. And then I want to align these pattern pieces, fabric pieces, so that they are exactly together down the center back. That's the important bit at the minute. And then I'm going to put my pattern piece on top, and this little T here is the notch where we're going to stitch up to. Now you can, and that's what this bit here is, the bit that is partially closed, and then the bit above it towards the shoulders and towards the neck is open. You can move that up. I would go maximum about 1 inch if you want some more coverage. If you go any higher up than that, you run the risk of not being able to get your head through when you put it on, particularly with the babies. Lots of babies have huge heads. If your baby has a huge head, I would recommend, if anything, you move it down a little bit. If you've got an average sized head baby, or you're an older child or an adult, then maximum you could move it up about 1 inch. For the ladies, we tested it to check that does cover most bra straps and kind of gives you as much of a an opening there as possible without showing the bra strap, but move it up, move it down, wherever you want that to be. But that is your little the notch that we talk about in the pattern. And then what I want to do is place a pin through both layers of my fabric where that notch is, so that that lines up there exactly. And I'm going to stitch this section here. So I'm going to put another pin at the bottom and put as many as you like in, and we're going to stitch from here to here. We're going to leave that top bit there open. So there we go, I've stitched from the notch down to the bottom, and when you open that up here to the front of the fabric, you'll see it's stitched up at the centre back, and then you've got these bits above the top that are open, your button loop, and you're going to put your button on there once it's all finished and nice like that, and it'll hold itself shut, but you'll be able to open it up to get the head in. Now at the back here, next thing to do is to press this whole seam here open, and then you can either once you've pressed it, you can either top stitch down one side across and then back up, or you can stitch all the way down each seam allowance, whichever you would prefer. What I'm going to do is press mine open and stitch down, across, and then back up again. Now if you were doing the woven version and you're not lining it and you've got a serger, you could follow the exact same steps that we did just then to serge both edges, or leave them, well in fact with woven I wouldn't leave them raw, but if you're doing woven using a serger you could do exactly what we just did. You don't have to do the other methods that I'm going to show you in a moment. So now I've got my skirt here with the back piece above it exactly as it will be when it's finished, and I'm going to flip my back down onto the bottom here, my top piece is down onto the bottom, and I'm going to line them up, and exactly as we have done for the other versions, I'm going to pin at the end, pin in the middle, pin on the darts, and stitch along using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and if I need to, serge it or trim it and press. So go ahead and do that right now. It's exactly the same as what we did before. So here we are, that is the back of the knit version complete, or the woven one if you want to use a serger. Now please excuse the wobbliness of the seam, I did it while I was looking at the camera, which is no good. Now technically I think the right thing to do is to press this upwards so that it curves nicely, but depending on how thick the various bits of your fabric are, you might find it easier to press downwards, so it's up to you whether you press upwards or downwards. And then this is how it looks from the other side. You've got your top stitching down like that, or down both sides, and it's joined at the waist. So that is the back of the knit partially closed version complete. So the next one we're going to do is the partially closed woven version. If you're not using a serger. So I have got my fabric here right sides together, and it's pretty similar to the knit one, except you're not going to do the button loop now. We're going to do that later when we bind the neckline. So I'm putting a pin in here where my little did I just do that in the right place? Yeah, where my little notch is, and I'm going to stitch from the base here up to the notch. I'm going to leave the top of the back open. So I have stitched up to here, and then I've opened it up, and this is from the back of the fabric, and I've pressed the seam open all the way to the top, so not just to where the seam ends, but all the way on these raw edges up to the top, and they are still kind of open like that. Now the way we're going to finish these raw edges is one of my favourite ways to do it, and I really can never understand why more people don't do this. I just love this. It's really simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take the seam allowance and I'm going to fold it in underneath itself from the bottom of the seam all the way to the top. Press. There we go. And then I'm going to press that, obviously using my iron, not just using my fingers. I'll use my fingers for the moment. There we go. I'm going to press that underneath on itself, and then I'm going to pin that, and I'm going to stitch all the way down. So I'm going to go press and pin that and show you what I've done. Before we finish up this woven partially closed option, I want to show you the lined partially closed version. Now this is going to be exactly the same whether you're using woven or knit fabric, the same as when we did the open back. what we just did was we folded under, we stitched up to here on the back pieces, and then we folded the seam allowance under. If you were going to do the lined partially closed back, don't fold the seam allowance under, just press it open, leave it like that, and then both your skirt and your top back piece need to be right side up. Fold your top back down, and then exactly like we have done before, align this, make sure your darts are both pointing outwards, and then stitch along using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And this will be, the raw edges will be exposed, but that's okay because we're going to be lining it. And then you do exactly the same thing with your lining to do the lined partially closed. But we're not doing the lined partially closed right now. We're going to finish off this woven partially closed. So I folded the edges under here, so the raw edges are all hidden. Now what I'd like you to do is stitch down, top stitch these seam allowances down so that it's all nice and neat. So now I have stitched down each of these seam allowances. So this is really lovely. This is why I love this type of seam so much. You can see my top stitching in a row. If I turn this around the right way, down the back, you've got the top half of the back open, the bottom half closed. Then, whoa, whoopsie daisy, we want to have it so that it's as if you would wear it, just like before, and flip it down, and then we're going to pin on the outside edge, pin these darts, and then I'd also probably pop a pin in the middle and stitch along using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now there are two ways you can finish this seam that we've just stitched all the way along there. One is with bias tape, or the second is with serging. Now I've finally found a use for my white spotty bias tape that you will see really nicely against this fabric. This is how it's looking at the moment. We've got the top back, skirt, darts, and we've stitched up the centre. And this is our woven version. If you're doing the lined version, with the partially closed back that I've been kind of showing you along with this one, you just leave this raw edge because it's going to be hidden inside the dress. For the woven one though, it's not going to be hidden. So what I'm going to do is cut this bias tape approximately to length. I'm not worried about the fact it's going to go over the edges. I'm quite happy with that. And then what I want to do is cut this seam allowance approximately in half. So it was a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm making it 1/4 inch. And if you're doing this version, you might be wondering, why have we got the seam allowance as 1/2 inch everywhere? It's because in some places you need it, and because there's so many different versions of the pattern, it would get super confusing if you'd made one version with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and another version with a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch. So we just decided blanket 1/2 inch seam allowance everywhere, and then we'd trim it where necessary. So what I'm going to do with this is exactly the same way I did the bias tape before, is I'm folding it out and I'm looking for this first fold line along here, and I'm going to line up this fold line with my raw edge, so that I'm going to be pinning it pretty much directly on top of that seam we just stitched. So I'm lining that up. I'm quite happy to have it hanging over the edge there, and this is exactly the same way we did the bias tape earlier for the woven fully open back. So if you watched that bit, you will already know how to do this. Whoopsie daisy. There we go. So it's pinned along here, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch along that bit there, and then I will press my bias tape up. So go ahead and do that now. So I've got my top folded down still, and I've just stitched my bias tape on along that first fold line, which is 1/4 inch in from the edge, and it's gone almost directly on top of my stitching, a little bit out in places, but it doesn't matter, because either that's going to be inside the seam allowance or it will have just created a slightly new stitch line. So ideally you want to get them exactly on top of each other, but that's I'm not concerned about that. I wouldn't bother unpicking that if that was me. If you want to make it perfect, you could, but I will quite happily leave that. So then what I've done is I've folded my bias tape up away from that raw edge, and I'm turning it all the way back around on itself so that it's going to cover the seam entirely. Sorry, cover the raw edges entirely. I'm making sure they're all tucked in, and then I'm going to pin all the way along here, and then I will be stitching all the way along here. And like I said in the other one, there's two different places you could stitch. One is sort of a slightly in from the edge, like a little top stitch to hold this on, or if you prefer, you can fold this edge slightly further down than the stitch line and do what's called stitching in the ditch. I don't particularly like that. I like to top stitch it on. But it's completely up to you, and that's personal preference. So once you've folded that all the way over and your raw edges are now totally enclosed in that, pin it and then stitch along there. So there we go, I've stitched along here, and as you can see, I stitched from that side along there, and then you can see the other line of stitching just underneath, or if you've aligned it up perfectly, that won't be showing. But either way, on the right side of the fabric you see absolutely nothing, and then on the back side of the fabric you've got a beautifully bound edge. You can fold this up or down when you press it. I would probably fold it the way that looks the prettiest, but also pay attention to how it wants to fold. Like I think because of the curve of the fabric, this wants to fold down more. It's not really wanting to go up. If I press it down with my fingers, it stays like that. And then I also just want to cut off very carefully, without cutting anything else, these little tails of bias tape that we don't need anymore, and get rid of those. And then we have a lovely finished back. So press that down and then you are done. We are out of day 2. Woohoo! So thank you so much for sticking with me with all of these versions, because there really have been a lot of versions for the back, because there are so many different options to what you can do. So next up, tomorrow, day 3, we are going to be doing the neckline. Now you can do pretty much any of the options I'm going to show you on any of the different garments. But I am going to show you a new thing that is not in the pattern, which is a facing, and that gives you a really lovely crisp edge on the V of the front. So stay tuned for tomorrow, can't wait.